The gray waters of the English Channel churned violently as the largest armada in human history cut through the pre-dawn darkness. It was June 6, 1944, and Private Thomas Mitchell of the 1st Infantry Division pressed his face against the cold metal of the landing craft, trying to steady his nerves. Around him, 30 other young Americans sat in grim silence, their faces pale green from seasickness and fear. The hook that would change everything had been set in motion 18 months earlier when Allied commanders began planning what would become Operation Overlord. General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had gambled everything on this single day. The weather had been miserable for days, but meteorologists predicted a brief window of opportunity. Eisenhower had made the fateful decision just 24 hours earlier. Okay, let's go. Mitchell clutched his M1 Garand rifle tighter as the landing craft pitched violently. He thought of his mother back in Ohio, probably just waking up to tend to the farm. She had no idea that her boy was about to storm the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. None of the families back home knew that 156,000 Allied troops were crossing the Channel at this very moment. The Atlantic Wall loomed ahead, Hitler's vaunted coastal defense system stretching from Norway to Spain. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months reinforcing these defenses, convinced that the invasion would come at Calais. Instead, the Allies had chosen Normandy, a stretch of coastline divided into 5 sectors with code names that would echo through history: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, according to wartime correspondent Ernie Pyle's dispatches, as referenced in various historical accounts of the period. The scale of the operation was beyond imagination. Over 5,000 ships of every description bobbed in the choppy waters, from massive battleships to tiny landing craft. The sky above thundered with the engines of 13,000 aircraft providing air cover and bombing runs. Mitchell's landing craft was heading for Omaha Beach, the bloodiest of the 5 landing zones. Intelligence reports had suggested light resistance, but the young private could already hear the distinctive crack of German MG-42 machine guns echoing across the water. The sound sent ice through his veins. Sergeant O'Malley, a grizzled veteran of the North African campaign, moved among the men with quiet confidence. "Remember your training, boys," he shouted over the engine noise. "Get off the beach fast. Find cover. Keep moving inland. The longer we stay on that sand, the more of us won't be going home." The ramp was about to drop. Mitchell could see the beach now, a killing field of obstacles, barbed wire, and concrete bunkers. Smoke and fire already marked where earlier waves had landed. Bodies floated in the surf, and the distinctive whine of artillery shells filled the air. 30 seconds, the coxswain yelled. Mitchell thought of the letter he'd written to his sweetheart, Sarah, still tucked in his breast pocket. In it, he'd tried to explain why this moment mattered, why everything they'd trained for led to this beach. The fate of democracy itself hung in the balance. Hitler's 1,000-year right controlled most of Europe, and this invasion was freedom's last, best. Hoped out the engines cut. In the sudden relative quiet, Mitchell could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Around him, 30 young men prepared to step into history. The ramp slammed down with a metallic crash, and machine gun fire immediately raked the landing craft. The first 3 men fell before they'd taken a step. Mitchell leaped over there. Bodies in the chest-deep water that ran red with blood. "Move, move, move," Sergeant O'Malley screamed, but his voice was nearly drowned by the cacophony of battle. German artillery shells exploded in geysers of sand and seawater, while the deadly chatter of MG-42 machine guns swept back and forth across the beach. Like a scythe, Mitchell struggled through the surf, his waterlogged equipment dragging him down. Men all around him were falling, cut down by the withering crossfire from the concrete bunkers above. The beach was a nightmare of twisted metal obstacles, designed by Rommel himself to tear apart landing craft and trap soldiers in the killing zone. The young private made it to the shingle, a narrow strip of stones at the base of the bluffs, and pressed himself flat against the small embankment. Bullets whined overhead, and he could hear the wet thud of rounds hitting flesh all around him. Captain Miller, his company commander, crawled up beside him, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "We've got to get up those bluffs," Miller gasped. "The whole invasion depends on taking these beaches." The captain's words echoed the desperate reality facing the Allied forces, according to historical military analyses of the battle. Failure at Omaha could have spelled disaster for the entire operation. but the German defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division were putting up fierce resistance. These weren't the second-rate troops intelligence had predicted, but battle-hardened veterans commanded by Colonel Goth. They'd had for years to prepare these defenses, and every angle was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Mitchell watched in horror as another wave of landing craft approached the beach. The Germans had zeroed in their artillery perfectly, and several boats disappeared in massive explosions before reaching shore. Those that made it through disgorged their human cargo into the meat grinder. A young medic named Doc Peterson crawled from casualty to casualty, trying desperately to save lives under impossible conditions. "I need more morphine," he shouted, to no one in particular. His Red Cross armband was splattered with blood, and his hand shook as he worked on a soldier whose leg had been nearly severed by shrapnel. The tide was coming in, and wounded men who couldn't move were drowning in the surf. Mitchell watched helplessly as a kid from Tennessee, probably no more than 18, called out for his mother before the waves took him under. The image would haunt Mitchell for the rest of his life. Sergeant O'Malley appeared beside them, his Thompson submachine gun chattering as he laid down covering fire. "We can't stay here," he yelled. "It's up those cliffs or we all die on this beach." The sergeant had already been wounded twice, but he kept moving, rallying his men through sheer force of will. A group of Rangers from the 2nd Battalion were attempting to scale the cliffs. Using rope ladders and grappling hooks, many fell to their deaths, but a few made it up and began attacking the German positions from behind. Their courage inspired others to follow. Mitchell gathered his remaining strength and sprinted across the sand toward a gap in the wire. German bullets kicked up sand around his feet, and he felt the heat of a tracer round pass inches from his head. Behind him, he could hear Captain Miller organizing another assault group. The beach was littered with the debris of war, abandoned equipment, destroyed vehicles, and too many bodies. But slowly, through incredible courage and sacrifice, small groups of Americans were finding ways up the bluffs. The invasion's success hung by a thread, but that thread was holding taut as Mitchell reached the base of the cliff. He looked back at the carnage below. Hundreds of his fellow soldiers lay dead or dying on the sand, but more kept coming. Wave after wave of landing craft continued to brave the deadly fire, bringing reinforcements and supplies. Democracy's greatest test was being written in blood on the beaches of Normandy. By 1000 hours, the situation at Omaha Beach remained desperate. German resistance had proven far stronger than anticipated, and casualties were mounting by the minute. From his command ship offshore, General Omar Bradley considered the unthinkable, evacuating the beach and redirecting forces to other sectors. Mitchell had managed to climb halfway up the bluff when a German grenade exploded nearby, showering him with dirt and debris. His ears rang, and blood trickled from a dozen small cuts, but he was still alive. Below him, the beach continued to fill with men and equipment, creating an increasingly tempting target for German artillery. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment had reached the same rocky outcropping as Mitchell. The colonel's uniform was torn and bloody, but his voice carried clear authority as he shouted to the men around him. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Taylor's words galvanized the scattered groups of soldiers clinging to the cliff face. Slowly, painfully, they began to work their way up the bluffs. Each step was contested by German defenders firing from concrete bunkers and camouflaged positions. The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Spaulding of the 16th Infantry found a narrow gully that provided some cover from the murderous crossfire. Working with his platoon, he managed to reach the top of the bluff and attack the German positions from behind. One by one, the machine gun nests that had been slaughtering Americans all morning began to fall silent. Naval fire support played a crucial role in turning the tide. Destroyers like the USS McCook had moved dangerously close to shore, their 5-inch guns pounding German positions at point-blank range. The ship's crews could see individual soldiers on the beach and adjusted their fire accordingly, despite the risk of running aground in the shallow water. As documented in official U.S. Army historical records of the operation, the courage of individual soldiers made the difference between victory and disaster. Men like Sergeant Stretchick, who single-handedly knocked out a German bunker with Bangalore torpedoes, a Private First Class Ponder, who made multiple trips across the beach to bring ammunition to the troops, even after being wounded twice. By noon, Mitchell had reached a German trench system at the top of the bluff, only to find it abandoned. the defenders were falling back to secondary positions, but their withdrawal was disorganized. The Americans had gained their first foothold on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Captain Miller had survived the beach assault and was now organizing his remaining men for the push inland. Of the 180 soldiers in his company, fewer than 60 were still able to fight, but reinforcements were finally making it up from the beach, including tanks and artillery that would be crucial for the next phase of the operation. The French village of Vierville-sur-Mer lay just beyond the bluffs, its stone houses and narrow streets providing the Germans with excellent defensive positions. But the psychological impact of losing the beach was devastating to German morale. Many defenders were foreign conscripts with little desire to die for Hitler's Reich. Mitchell took a moment to look back at the beach below. The tide had turned. Both literally and figuratively, landing craft were now arriving in steady streams, disgorging men and equipment with increasing efficiency. The dead still littered the sand, but medics were evacuating the wounded, and engineers were clearing obstacles and laying down steel matting for vehicles. Sergeant O'Malley appeared at Mitchell's side, grinning despite a bandage wrapped around his head. "Well, boy, we made it off that damn beach," he said. "Now the real fighting begins." The sergeant was right. Taking the beach was only the first step. Ahead lay the hedgerow country of Normandy, where every field was a potential fortress, and every village a battleground. The Germans would fight desperately to throw the invaders back into the sea, bringing up their panzer reserves and launching counterattacks. But something fundamental had changed. On the morning of June 6th, the Atlantic Wall had been breached, and Allied forces were pouring through the gap. The Third Reich's Western Front, which had been static for 4 years, was suddenly fluid again. The liberation of Europe had begun. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Norman countryside, Mitchell's unit pushed inland through the maze of hedgerows that characterized this ancient agricultural region. Each field was bordered by thick earthen banks topped with centuries-old hedges, creating a patchwork of natural fortresses that the Germans had turned into killing fields. The Bocage country, as the French called it, was unlike anything the Americans had trained for in England. Every advance required careful coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. A single German machine gun crew, well positioned behind a hedgerow, could hold up an entire battalion for hours. Mitchell's company had linked up with elements of the 29th Infantry Division, creating a mixed force of battle-tested veterans and green troops who had never seen combat before today. The contrast was stark. Veterans like Sergeant O'Malley moved with practiced efficiency, while newcomers jumped at every sound and fired at shadows. Captain Miller had established a temporary command post in a shell-damaged farmhouse on the outskirts of Vierville-sur-Mer. Maps covered every available surface, and radio operators maintained contact with units scattered across the beachhead. The captain's face showed the strain of the day's fighting, but his voice remained steady as he briefed his platoon leaders. "Intelligence. Our EPO or TS German armor moving up from Bayeux," Miller announced, pointing to positions marked on his map. "The 21st Panzer Division is probably already en route. We need to dig in and prepare for counterattacks." The mention of German panzers sent a chill through the assembled soldiers. American Sherman tanks were finally making it inland, but they were no match for the massive Tiger and Panther tanks that equipped elite German units. Success would depend on coordination, air support, and the individual courage of soldiers like Mitchell. By 1600 hours, the beachhead had expanded to roughly 6 miles wide. At 1 mile deep, it was a tenuous foothold, but Allied forces were streaming ashore at unprecedented rates. Utah Beach had been secured with relatively light casualties, while the British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches had made steady progress inland. The first German counterattack came at dusk. Mitchell heard the distinctive rumble of tank engines long before he saw the gray shapes moving through the hedgerows. Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets streaked through the gathering darkness, and the sharp crack of high-velocity tank guns echoed across the countryside. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran of the Italian campaign, positioned his squad in a stone barn overlooking the main road into Vierville. "Wait until they're close," he whispered to his men. "Bazookas are useless at long range." The sergeant's calm demeanor helped steady the younger soldiers, who were about to face German armor for the first time. According to post-war German military records, as referenced in various historical studies, the 21st Panzer Division's counterattack was poorly coordinated and launched late in the day. Many units were still moving up from reserve positions when they should have been hitting the beaches at dawn. The battle for the hedgerows raged through the night. Mitchell's platoon held their position despite repeated German attempts to break through. Panzer Grenadiers, elite German infantry, attacked with desperate courage, knowing that failure to throw back the invasion could mean the end of the Third Reich. Private Jackson, the unit's youngest member at barely 19, distinguished himself by knocking out a German half-track with a well-placed rifle grenade. The explosion lit up the darkness, revealing a full squad of enemy soldiers advancing through the next field. Mitchell and his comrades poured rifle fire into the exposed Germans, breaking up their attack. As dawn approached on June 7th, the immediate crisis had passed. German counterattacks had been repulsed, though at considerable cost to both sides. The beachhead was holding, and reinforcements continued to pour across the channel. Allied air superiority was beginning to tell, as Thunderbolt and Mustang fighters strafed German positions with impunity. Mitchell found himself sharing a foxhole with a British paratrooper. From the 6th Airborne Division, the trooper had been fighting since midnight on June 6th, when his unit had dropped inland to secure vital bridges and crossroads. His red beret was torn and bloody, but his spirits remained high. "Jerry threw everything he had at us," the paratrooper said in his crisp accent. "But we held the line. Now it's up to you lads to keep pushing inland." The British soldier's confidence was infectious, reminding Mitchell that this was truly an Allied effort, with soldiers from dozens of nations united in a common cause. The liberation of Europe was no longer in doubt. The question now was how long it would take and how many would die in the process. Dawn on June 7th revealed the true cost of Operation Overlord's opening day. Medics worked frantically to evacuate casualties from makeshift aid stations, while Graves registration units began the grim task of collecting and identifying the dead. Mitchell helped carry wounded comrades to the beach evacuation point. Each trip a sobering reminder of war's brutal arithmetic. The Allied beachhead has survived its first critical 24 hours, but at a staggering price: preliminary casualty. Reports indicated over 10,000 Allied losses on D-Day alone, with Omaha Beach accounting for more than half that number. Yet the strategic objective had been achieved. Hitler's Atlantic Wall was broken, and a second front in Western Europe was now a reality. General Montgomery's 21st Army Group headquarters had established a command post just inland from Gold Beach, coordinating the actions of British, Canadian, and American forces across the expanding beachhead. The general's precise planning and attention to detail were evident in every aspect of the operation, from logistics coordination to the integration of air and naval support. Mitchell's unit was assigned to help clear the coastal town of Port-ten-Bessin, a small fishing village that controlled access to one of the few harbors in the invasion sector. German naval infantry had turned every stone house into a fortress, and clearing operations proceeded house by house, room by room. The fighting was brutal and personal. Mitchell found himself face to face with a young German soldier, probably no older than himself, in the narrow hallway of a destroyed cottage. For a split second, both men hesitated, seeing their common humanity despite the uniform differences. Then training took over, and only Mitchell walked away from that encounter. Captain Miller had been promoted to major after his company commander was killed by a sniper. The battlefield promotion reflected the severe officer casualties suffered during the initial assault, but also recognized Miller's exceptional leadership under fire. He now commanded a composite battalion made up of survivors from multiple units. The German response to the invasion was hampered by Hitler's rigid command structure and his obsession with controlling every military decision. From his headquarters in East Prussia, Field Marshal Rommel was absent from Normandy, having returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, while other key commanders were attending war games exercises far from the front. As documented in post-war intelligence assessments, German forces in Normandy were caught completely off guard by the timing and location of the invasion. The elaborate deception operations, collectively known as Operation Fortitude, had convinced German high command that the main assault would come at Pas de Calais, leaving Normandy relatively lightly defended. By June 8th, Allied engineers had begun construction of artificial harbors, massive prefabricated concrete structures that would enable the rapid unloading of supplies and reinforcements. The Mulberry Harbors, as they were codenamed, represented one of the war's most ambitious engineering projects, demonstrating Allied technological superiority and logistical planning. Mitchell watched in amazement as sections of the artificial harbor were towed across the channel by fleets of tugboats. Each concrete caisson was the size of a city block. yet they were positioned with mathematical precision to create protected anchorages. In the open ocean, the sight reinforced his growing confidence that the Allies possessed the resources and determination to see this campaign through to victory. The human cost of that victory, however, continued to mount. Every village liberated, every crossroad secured, came at the price of young lives cut short. Mitchell carried a growing collection of personal effects from fallen comrades. A letter from Johnson's wife, Martinez's rosary, a photograph of Kowalski's baby daughter. French civilians began emerging from their hiding places. As Allied forces pushed further inland, their joy at liberation was tempered by the destruction that had been visited upon their communities. Many spoke of German reprisals against suspected resistance members, while others described the harsh occupation that had lasted for long years. An elderly French farmer approached Mitchell's squad as they established a checkpoint outside the village of Colville-sur-Mer. "Merci, merci," the old man repeated, tears streaming down his weathered face as he pressed a bottle of Calvados into Sergeant O'Malley's hands. The apple brandy had been hidden from the Germans throughout the occupation, save for this moment of liberation. As the sun set on their third day in Normandy, Mitchell reflected on how completely his world had changed. Since stepping off that landing craft at Omaha Beach, he was no longer the farm boy from Ohio who had worried about impressing his girl back home. War had aged him years in just days, teaching him lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the bonds between soldiers that no training could have provided. The liberation of Europe would take 11 more months of fighting, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Democracy had established its foothold on the continent, and no force on earth could push it back into the sea. June 10th brought news that electrified the Allied forces. The beachheads had been linked into a continuous front, stretching nearly 50 miles along the Norman coast. What had begun as 5 separate landing zones was now a unified lodgment that could absorb whatever the Germans threw against it. Mitchell's battalion had been assigned to the drive toward Corentin, a strategic crossroads town that controlled the causeways connecting the Cotentin Peninsula to the rest of Normandy. The mission was critical until Corentin fell. There remained a dangerous gap between Utah Beach and the other landing zones. The advance through the Norman bocage continued to exact a terrible toll. Every hedgerow concealed potential death. Every farmhouse might harbor a sniper. Every village crossroads could be zeroed in by German artillery. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles, and each yard cost blood. Sergeant O'Malley had proven himself a master of small unit tactics, turning his squad into a precision instrument of war. "The key is coordination," he explained to his men during a brief rest in a shell-damaged orchard. "Covering fire, movement, communication. We work together or we die separately." The sergeant's words were prophetic. Later that morning, while advancing on a German strongpoint built around a Norman church, the squad came under intense machine gun fire. Private Henderson was hit immediately, crying out as he fell in the middle of a muddy field with no cover. Without hesitation, Mitchell crawled forward under fire to reach his wounded comrade. German bullets snapped overhead and kicked up dirt around him, but he pressed on. Behind him, O'Malley and the others provided covering fire, their M1 rifles cracking steadily as they engaged the German positions. "I got you, Henderson," Mitchell whispered as he reached the wounded soldier. "We're going home together." The private had taken a round through the shoulder. Painful, but not fatal if they could get him to a medic quickly. Mitchell threw Henderson over his shoulder and began the desperate crawl back to Allied lines. The rescue took 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. By the time Mitchell dragged Henderson to safety, both men were covered in mud and blood, but they were alive. Doc Peterson, their company medic, immediately went to work on Henderson's wound while praising Mitchell's courage. Similar acts of heroism were being repeated across the Norman countryside as Allied forces ground their way inland. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had been fighting since the early morning hours of D-Day, holding vital crossroads and bridges against determined German counterattacks, according to wartime reports from embedded correspondents like Ernie Pyle, as referenced in numerous historical accounts. The performance of American soldiers in their first major European campaign exceeded all expectations. Men who had never seen combat before June 6th were displaying the kind of tactical proficiency and raw courage that characterized veteran units. Major Miller had established his command post in the ruins of a medieval abbey outside Corentin. The ancient stone walls provided some protection from German artillery, while the elevated position offered excellent observation of the surrounding countryside. Radio operators maintained constant contact with supporting artillery and air units. The Germans are bringing up reserves, Miller briefed his company commanders. Intelligence reports elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division moving into our sector. These aren't the second-rate troops we've been facing. They're elite units with the latest equipment. The warning proved accurate. That afternoon, German forces launched their most determined counterattack yet. Spearheaded by Panther tanks and supported by veteran SS infantry, the battle raged across the hedgerows and orchards of Normandy, with neither side willing to give ground. Mitchell found himself in a desperate firefight with SS troops who had infiltrated to within 50 yards of the American positions. These weren't the demoralized defenders they had faced on the beaches, but fanatical soldiers fighting for their twisted ideology. The combat was vicious and personal, decided by individual courage and split-second decisions. The tide turned when Allied fighter bombers arrived on station, their thunderbolts diving through German flank to strafe enemy positions. The sight of American aircraft operating with complete freedom of action reminded everyone that the Luftwaffe was finished as an effective fighting force. As darkness fell on June 10th, Corinth remained in German hands, but their defensive perimeter was cracking. Allied pressure was relentless, and German reserves were being ground down in futile counterattacks. The outcome was inevitable, even if the cost remained horrifically high. That night, huddled in a foxhole carved from Norman soil, Mitchell wrote another letter to Sarah. He couldn't tell her where he was or what he had seen, but he tried to convey his growing confidence that they would win this war and build a better world from its ashes. The hedgerows of Normandy were teaching hard lessons about the price of freedom, but they were also revealing the character of the men willing to pay that price. June 12, 1944 marked a week since the Allied invasion began, and the transformation of Normandy was complete. What had been Hitler's impregnable Atlantic Wall now served as the foundation for a massive Allied base, with supplies and reinforcements flowing across the channel in an endless stream. Mitchell stood at the edge of Corinth's town square, watching French civilians emerge from cellars and bombed-out buildings where they had sheltered during the battle. Children peered cautiously round corners while elderly women swept debris from their doorsteps, beginning the long process of rebuilding their shattered community. The final assault on Corinth had come at dawn, with elements of the 500 and 2nd Parachute Infantry Regiment leading the attack. Mitchell's unit had supported the paratroopers, fighting house to house through streets littered with rubble and the detritus of war. By noon, the last German resistance had been crushed. Sergeant O'Malley emerged from a damaged cafe carrying a dented coffee pot and several cracked cups. Found some real French coffee, he announced with a grin. Figured we deserved something better than that powdered stuff they give us. The sergeant's ability to find small comforts amid the devastation never ceased to amaze his men. The victory at Corinth had strategic implications far beyond the capture of a single town. With the gap between Utah Beach and the other landing zones finally closed, Allied forces could coordinate their operations across the entire Normandy front. The beachhead was no longer a collection of isolated toeholds, but a unified base for the liberation of Western Europe. Major Miller had been wounded during the final assault, taking shrapnel from a German Panzerfaust rocket that destroyed his command post. As medics loaded him onto a stretcher for evacuation to England, he grabbed Mitchell's arm with surprising strength. "Tell the boys they did good," Miller whispered through gritted teeth. "Tell them we held up our end." The major's words carried special weight, coming from an officer who had led from the front throughout the campaign and earned his men's complete respect through shared hardship. The cost of the Normandy campaign was becoming clearer with each passing day. Casualty reports indicated that Allied forces had suffered over 20,000 dead and wounded in the first week alone. German losses were even higher, but the human cost of Operation Overlord weighed heavily on survivors like Mitchell. Yet, the strategic situation had been transformed beyond recognition. German forces in Western Europe were now fighting on two fronts, with the Soviet Union pressing from the east and Allied armies advancing from Normandy. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was being squeezed in a vice that grew tighter with each passing day. French resistance fighters, emboldened by the Allied invasion, were emerging from hiding to harass German supply lines and provide intelligence on enemy movements. A young woman named Murray approached Mitchell's squad outside Corinth, offering to guide them through German minefields that blocked the road to Saint-La. "I'd have been waiting for years for this day," she said in heavily accented English. My brother was shot by the SS for refusing to work in their factories. Now we have our chance for revenge. Her eyes blazed with the fierce determination that characterized the French resistance. Throughout the occupation, the broader implications of D-Day's success were becoming apparent to soldiers and commanders alike, as documented in contemporary military analyses. The invasion had achieved its primary objective of establishing a permanent foothold in Western Europe, but it had also demonstrated Allied superiority in planning, logistics, and combined arms warfare. Mitchell received word that his company was being rotated back to England for rest and refitting. After a week of continuous combat, the survivors were exhausted physically and emotionally. Yet there was also a sense of accomplishment that no amount of fatigue could diminish. They had proven themselves against Hitler's best troops and emerged victorious. As his unit marched toward the beach evacuation point, Mitchell passed endless columns of fresh troops heading inland. The men looked impossibly young and eager, much as he must have appeared a week earlier. He wanted to warn them about what lay ahead, but he also knew that some lessons could only be learned through experience. The landing craft that took Mitchell back to England was filled with wounded soldiers, a sobering reminder of war's cost. Yet as the Norman coast faded into the distance, he felt a profound sense of pride in what had been accomplished. Democracy had been tested in the crucible of combat and had not been found wanting. The invasion that shaped the world was far from over. Months of bitter fighting lay ahead as Allied forces battled their way across France, through the Low Countries, and into the heart of Nazi Germany itself. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. On the beaches of Normandy, ordinary men had achieved extraordinary things, proving that free peoples possessed an inner strength that no totalitarian regime could match. Mitchell fingered the letter from Sarah, still tucked in his breast pocket after 7 days of combat. When he finally made it home, he would have stories to tell and lessons to share. But first, there was a war to finish and a world to liberate. The dawn of freedom had broken over Normandy, and its light would continue spreading until it illuminated every corner of occupied Europe. The boy from Ohio had become a man on the beaches of Normandy, shaped by sacrifice and forged in the fire of history's greatest amphibious assault. The invasion that shaped the world had also shaped him, and he would carry its lessons for the rest of his life.